Hey guys, this week is all about rules of deduction. So you've read about rules of deduction in your textbook and you had some practice applying them on one of your homework assignments from last week. Now we're going to go deeper into rules of deduction. So first, what are rules of deduction? Well, in a valid argument, we use rules of deduction to get from our premises to our conclusion. Remember that in a valid argument, it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So if the premises were true in a valid argument, then the conclusion would also have to be true. In a valid argument, the conclusion just follows from the premises. For example, let's say that Sherlock Holmes walks into the scene of a murder. He sees a dead woman's body on the floor. He sees that the woman has a single knife wound in the stomach, and he sees a bloody knife on the coffee table. Sherlock can deduce, based on the evidence, that the cause of death was stabbing with a knife. But how? Well, let's see. Let's put up his premises and his conclusion, and we're going to substitute variables in for the content just to keep us clear on what's going on. So his first premise would be, if you are dead and have a single stab wound, then you are stabbed to death. So we have if you are dead and you have a single stab wound, then you are stabbed to death. And we have that the victim is dead and has a single stab wound. And he therefore concludes that the victim was stabbed to death. This is basic modus ponens. So here we have a conditional claim, and the antecedent is our premises. And if our premises include a conditional claim and the antecedent, then we can just deduce the conclusion. We just know that the conclusion follows. So this is just modus ponens. And as we all know, modus ponens is a valid argument pattern. So this is a valid pattern of deduction. Okay, but let's say that for this case, Sherlock brings dear Mrs. Hudson, Sherlock's landlady. So she accompanies him to the crime scene. She sees the victim on the floor. She sees the knife wound. She sees the bloody knife also. But what she also notices is that there's a broken plate in the kitchen. And from this, she concludes that not only was the victim stabbed to death, but that the stabbing was the result of some sort of a domestic dispute. Did this conclusion follow validly from the premises, or did we use a valid pattern or rule of deduction in order to get from these premises to that conclusion? Well, let's see. So she has some of the same, she has all of the same premises as Sherlock. So first she says, if you are dead and you were stabbed, then you were stabbed to death. And she also has that the victim is dead and the victim was stabbed, has a knife wound. Okay, and then she also has this other conditional claim that would say that if there was a domestic dispute, then there will be broken items in the house. If S, then T. And there's a broken item in the house. There's a broken plate. She says all these together can lead us to conclude that the woman was stabbed to death and that it was the result of some sort of a domestic dispute. Okay, so is this valid? Did we follow valid rules of deduction to get here? Well, we know that we can get R from the premise 1 and premise 2 using modus ponens. So we know that R is okay, but in order for this to be a valid argument, the whole conclusion has to follow straight from the premises. So what about S? Can we get S from any of these premises? Well, let's look. Premise 3 says if S, then T. And premise 4 says T. Now, in a conditional claim, is it valid to conclude that the antecedent is true just because the consequent is true? No. We know that there's situations in which you can have a true conditional claim and the consequent can be true, but the antecedent can be false. So, for example, what if there's a counterexample? Like if one of the clumsy investigators accidentally broke the plate, or if there was a burglar who came in while the woman was eating and that startled her, causing her to drop and break the plate. So there's lots of ways that this plate could be broken that wouldn't necessarily indicate that a domestic dispute had taken place and that that was tied to the murder. Okay, so we know that there's a counterexample. We also know, based on our conversation before about necessity and sufficiency, that While S is sufficient for T, S is not necessary for T. So just because we have T, it's not necessarily the case that we have S. So we have a lot of reasons that we know that this is not valid, that it's not necessarily the case that we would have R and S in our conclusion. So Mrs. Hudson, well-meaning as she is, did not make a valid deduction. This means that we couldn't deduce her conclusion from the evidence alone. Sherlock, however, did make a valid deduction because we could deduce his conclusion from the evidence alone. Similarly, in a valid argument, we can deduce the conclusion from the premises alone. So if we have an argument and we can get from the premises to the conclusion using rules of deduction, then we know that we have a valid argument. Okay, that's our background on the rules of deduction. In the next videos, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the trickier rules of deduction. Then we'll practice using those rules to determine validity of arguments.